Hi there, I'm Ken Lammers. Peace be with all of y'all. And today on Commonplace Catholic, we're going to talk about Pope Joan or Popess Joan. So let's get to it.
Lord Jesus Christ.
युगान युग तेरा ही है.
Ilekroć bowiem sprawujemy pamiątkę ofiary Chrystusa.
Kweli ni vema na haki tukushukuru daima na popote, Bwana Baba mwema.
主の御体と御血になりますように。
Okay, so um, I have grown up my entire life in places dominated by Protestants, primarily Baptists, but other churches, Protestant groups as well. Maybe for the first year or so of my life, when after I'd just been born, when I was in Cincinnati, before my parents moved to Lexington, Kentucky, I perhaps was in a place where there was more Catholics than there were other faiths. But once I was in Lexington, from that point on, there were always more Protestants around me than there were Catholics. And then, now I live in the Appalachian Mountains, where for a long time I was the token Catholic in my office. Now, there's now another woman who's in our office who's Catholic, and I think we may at least be 50% of the Catholic population in our county. It's an exaggeration, but I'm not sure by how much. But yeah, we are very, very outnumbered. There's a lot of Protestants. Generally, this is all fine, no big problem. But what I have heard over the years, being around so many Protestants, is various and sundry arguments against the faith and against the church, right? Hear them all the time. You've not been saved. Well, I'm pretty sure that my baptism when I was 2 weeks old, which washed me free of original sin, probably counts as salvation, as well as Eucharist every week and that sort of thing. And you say that to your Protestant friends, and they kind of look at you going, huh? And we may later, for some of my friends out there, go through the sacraments so that they can understand the continuing fruits of the faith that come from the grace of the church, right? Grace through the church. But that's another day. This week, I got hit with a critique of the church that I had never heard before. And it went something along the lines of, well, you had a transvestite pope. And I must admit, I went, what? Huh? And Pope Joan was a female who dressed like a male, and I was like, I'm flat-footed. I've never heard of this before, right? And I'm like, maybe an anti-pope or something like that. And the person's like, nope, it was a pope. Okay. So later on, I go and do research. Okay, and there's something to this. It's a myth, but there's something to it. So I find this interesting, and I thought I'd share what I found with y'all. So here's a picture of Popess Joan or Pope Joan, depending on whether you're old enough that you still use indicators that a word is female or for a female. But okay, so Pope Joan is a myth that popped up in the 13th century, in 1200s, and says that like a couple hundred years ago, there was, I think it, saying it was in the 11th century, maybe. I'm not, but they cite a time, and they say there was a female pope. Right now, the myths then turn into a whole bunch of different things about that. Uh, the oldest myth, and this is came from some Dominican, was that an unnamed woman had become pope, and she'd done it, while pretending to be male. And then one day, while she was riding a horse, she has a baby, and as soon as she has a baby, she's tied to the tail of the horse, dragged behind it, stoned to death, and then taken and buried and I don't know what happened to her son. So that's like the original story. It's, wow, okay. And then there's later stories on this as you go along. That story seems to develop, right? Uh, the story seems to develop that she is a very educated woman. Like her lover brings her to the church one way or another, and she obviously at some point she decides starts pretending to be a male, and you see some say that she went into the church because she's following this guy. The majority of thought seems to be she went to the church because she wanted to become a learned person, and that's how you had to be a male to become a learned person. So she pretended to be male, and she becomes a secretary for the Curia in Rome. The bigwigs in Rome. Then she becomes a cardinal. I'm not sure how you go from being a secretary to cardinal. There obviously she must become a priest somewhere in between, and then she eventually becomes pope. Uh, the story then seems to go on in the more developed stories that one of the people who's an attendee who works for her, I don't know if it's a regular person or a priest or whomever, and her start having an affair, and on a march from St. Peter to the Lateran Church, she has a baby on the march in the procession, and that thereafter she's killed, or no, she dies, uh, and that all starts to depending on what writer you look at in that from the time period, all that starts to vary. And initially, the older stuff says she has a son. There's some later things that say she has a daughter. Initially, it says she died. Well, initially the one with unnamed says she was killed. Then there are other ones that say she died after the childbirth, which would not have been terribly uncommon back in the day, and other ones that say that she survived for years. I mean, obviously lost the position, but survived for years, but had to do penance. And other ones that say that she was given a choice, had a vision, was given a choice, and she could be punished and die in the secular world, or she would receive her punishment when she died and had to face her maker. And she chose to be punished and die in the secular world. So there's all sorts of myths about this, and it evolves and changes, right? Uh, Now, in the common faith, the people who are out there who just have faith and aren't really questioning things and uh, aren't really um, really into the theology and don't look at the history to see, well, could this really work? That sort of thing. She's she kind of catches the minds of the people, which goes along until you see a little bit of art about her, like this thing here. Um, there's another picture with her holding a baby. It's just really a terrible picture. And there's some better ones that seem to be part of tarot cards and things, which I didn't take that. But that's it all seemed to among the common faithful, it caught on. Well, then comes the 15th, 16th century when the church starts looking more rationally at things, and there's a lot of thought. There's thought coming out of Catholic theologians and historians going, "This no way. This is not real. It didn't happen. There's no way." And of course, at the same time, just about that time, you run into the Protestant schism, right? The Protestants go into schism against the church, and they want to use Pope Joan as a club to beat the church over the head, dunk, 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 because obviously the church is evil if it's had a woman at its head, right? Uh, Strange thought, but I mean, that's where it is. And so they are having that fight. And that goes on until 16. Let me see, what was the date? 1656, I think it is, 1657. And there, a Protestant theologian by the name of Blondel, Blondel, publishes just a, a refutation of it all that sticks, right? He's like, this doesn't make any sense. And apparently got in some trouble with his fellow Protestants because they wanted that story out there so they could use it against the church. But he pretty much definitively proved no, there was no female pope back in the day. Now, of course, you get there, and what are the proof factors of, now we don't need to go there yet. What are the proof factors of it not being legit, not being real? Well, okay, the one that you run into first is that in the 13th century, when they start talking about this, they're looking back a couple hundred years. There's nobody contemporary, nobody anywhere contemporary saying that there was a female pope or talking about any of this stuff. This is all myth that shows up later, right? So that's actually fairly persuasive. And then there's a really kind of involved historical discussion about, look, we know this pope followed this pope, followed this pope, and yeah, there's an anti-pope in here, but the popes all followed, and they're all male, even the anti-pope, and there are papers that went from them back and forth and around that show that, that it's not just us, somebody filling a period of time saying, yeah, there was a male pope here. There's actually papers that went out and, show that, the male pope was running the Vatican. So there's no time period when it's supposed to be, which could have had a female pope. So those are pretty convincing arguments. And I ask you, if you're skeptical of me, go look them up yourself. There's apparently quite a bit of that out there. So what has happened since it's been debunked and we know there's no female pope, there's been some research over the years into why people thought there was a female pope, and one of the strands is there was thought it's something that came from the Orthodox Church. There was thought that a myth back in the day that there had been a female patriarch in Constantinople over the Eastern Orthodox Church. And that myth migrates into the West somehow through trade, who knows how, and that got into the West, and that idea got there, and it blossomed. And of course, the people in the West, they don't know the patriarch from nobody, so they fill in pope instead of patriarch. That's one explanation. You see historians going back and trying to pluck all the things together to make another explanation, right? And for instance, part of the myth is that there's a route between St. Peter's and Lateran that the popes don't travel, and that there's at the other church there's a seat there where the pope would sit, and it has a hole in the bottom, and he's checked to see if he's got the parts the guy's supposed to have. And this has been part of the myth, and you see historians trying to debunk all this. Nobody knows how these myths really start. I mean, I think the Byzantine thing is probably a pretty good pretty good explanation. But you see things where they go, well, it could have been that they found pictures of pagan goddesses and all that from the past in Rome, and they looked papal, and so there people said, female pope, and then then they noticed that the pope didn't travel this one single route, so that's where the female pope was killed. And the thing about the about the Pope sitting on a seat where there's a hole in it, which seems to have been truthful. The Pope would sit on this seat. It was a marble seat, and it was a holdover from ancient Roman days, where it was basically a latrine. Right, you had a hole just like you do when you go to your toilet. It had a hole in it, and you know, apparently the Pope would sit on this. It was outside the church he was going to, and sit there as festivities were going on. And they claim that that was, no, he wasn't getting checked. Of course, that doesn't really seem to me that it would work anyway, because the Pope was wearing robes, and if he sat, the robes would go down to his knees, and unless he just went like this and held them up, which, well, who knows? And no. Now, I will say myself, I grew up, and I remember, I don't know if it's a myth or not, either learning or being taught or whatever, that popes used to get checked to make sure they weren't castrati, because back in the day, when they wanted to make sure guys could hit those high peak notes in the choir, certain guys got, and if you weren't qualified to be pope, so they would check to make sure of that. I don't know if that's true either, and if it's true, I don't know if it's still done, but they, the historians go back and they try to explain away all the myths around. It's always interesting watching historians try to do that. They never do it exactly so it fits, but like I said, it's a fairly debunked myth, and those explanations of how it rose are just kind of an interesting side story. So in the modern era, though, what's an interesting thing has happened is that Pope Joan seems to have become a focus of feminist art. Now, if you look through the internet, which I did, you can find sculptures. I found a sculpture called Pope Joan that was being sold for $5,500 plus $300 shipping by an artist, and it was basically a boat model that had been taken down and some metal had been put on it, and I don't know. Didn't look like anything human to me. I'm not sure how she made the Pope Joan thing, but it was a feminist piece of art. Pope Joan, right? It's there. There are other feminist artists out there who have fastened on the Pope Joan story, and you will find some pictures, some paintings, some live art type things, photos that will tend to fall into that as well. As well, there are plays, and so I've clipped part of a play here, and this is from, what is it? Top Girls. So this was it. From what I've seen of it, I'm not terribly impressed, but that's seen in clips of it, which has bad sound, right? And it apparently is a bunch of women who are at least somewhat mythically the important women of history or something like that, and they're all sitting there kvetching around a lunch where they're sharing wine, etc. So that's what this is, and here's the well, I'll just show you a section.
The procession never went down that street again. I remember you specifically. Yes, they had to go all around to avoid it. And they introduced a pierced chair. Pierced chair? Yeah. A chair made of solid marble with a hole in the seat, and it was in the chapel of the Savior. And after he was elected, the Pope had to sit on it. Oh, well, look at me sit on it. Two of the clergy made sure he was a man. Oh, he could have made him.
And that's, that play goes on. Pope Joan is there for a good portion of the play, and they're all kind of back and forth going on at each other. And Pope Joan in the play is, earlier in the play, she describes the myth of herself, becoming Pope and all that sort of thing, and having an affair with her attendee. And that gets kind of crude, so I didn't play that part. Yeah, but it follows the myth. And then there you saw more of the myth where she's talking about popes getting checked and all sorts of stuff and not using the road and all that. So it's there. It is part of a modern feminist thing. And I'm not sure how well that carries anymore. Of course, obviously, feminism now is, I won't say it's in decline, but it's not in most favor because it conflicts with other things that are going on in the world at the moment. But Pope Joan's still out there as a myth and is still being used by certain individuals for certain things. And one of the reasons I know this is a myth is because if it's for real, when we had that synod just recently, and the Pope said, no, we're not going to have female deacons or priests, right? He said no, that the people who are so in favor of there being female deacons and priests would have used Pope Joan, if it was real, to just start beating them over the head, going, look, we've done it in the past, you need to do it now, But obviously they didn't, and they obeyed the Pope. So apparently we're not going to have any deacons or priests that are female anytime soon. That's a topic for another day. And I think this is one of those interesting nooks and crannies in the Catholic Church. It's been around for 2,000 plus years. Well, about 2,000 years, not really 2,000 plus yet, but been around for about 2,000 years. And there's all these kind of interesting things that happen here, there, now, and gone. That you can't know all of it. You can't know everything in the church. It's just not really possible. The church is so big and so involved, and these kind of fun, interesting parts of history are worth knowing because they give you a flavor for the entire church and what's gone on through the history of it. And I think that's it for today, folks. If you want more, there's plenty more on the internet you can go look up. And other people have done, videos about this as well. You can go look at those too. If you like what you saw today, folks, hit the like button. That means more people will probably see it because they'll come look and it'll recommend it to them. If you like it, what you're here today, subscribe, hit the bell, all that good stuff. And so you get notifications. As always, I say there's no imprimatur here. Nobody from the Pope down to the lowest deacon or hermit has approved anything I've said. And, of course, on the other hand, still haven't had the Inquisition come knocking down my front door. So apparently I'm not that far off base that I'm worth going after. So that's it for this week, folks. Go with God, and I'll see you next time, and we'll see what other interesting things about the Catholic faith we can figure out. Bye now.